Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. This podcast series is brought to you by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. Richard, it's been about a month, and it's been a while since we've caught up. What have you been up to recently?
Well, I've been up to the task of getting sick along with the rest of my family. All of us, my wife and all of our kids, we were sick. And it was kind of bad. It took several weeks to fully recover because it takes time for everyone to recover. But I was pretty sick too. I'm going to spare you from the substance and the gory details. I mean, first of all, everyone's fine now. So there it is. But I was, reflecting on like when you're sick, when you have a fever, or I mean, I've had my back hurt, I've had my leg hurt. I had an ACL tear years ago when I was like in high school. And I remember, when you have an injury like that, you're just kind of immobilized, or, I mean, you can't move around in the way that, you could pain-free back into the day. And when you're actually injured like that, let's say with a back injury, which is, I mean, a lot of people suffer from it.
Yes.
But when you're injured like that, all you can think about is, first of all, like, your mind tends to focus on the pain, but also you just get frustrated and you're just thinking, wow, like, when will I be able to just function normally, like move around normally without the pain? And then you're just thinking, well, most of the time I was moving around like that without the pain. And I never thought about it. I was never that grateful because you just take it for granted, right? I mean, that's a kind of cliche line, but it's so true. You don't think about it. But, I mean, like right now, I don't have that back pain, but I'm not like all the time, like grateful and, thinking about how great it is just to be able to walk around without pain. But I'm just thinking like, oh, maybe I should be. I ought to be like sometimes sickness or injury kind of reminds me of like how much more grateful I should be. And I was having those thoughts, and I just, I thought it kind of interesting how asymmetrical it is.
So that phenomenon sometimes is called adaptive preferences, where you have these, maybe that's not quite the right word, but this basically self-reported satisfaction with your life can oftentimes adapt to your circumstances. And it seems to be extremely sensitive to what you take for granted and what you don't take for granted. So if you basically don't ever seriously entertain the thought that you could have trouble walking or trouble eating food, actually enjoying eating food, if it's the stomach flu or something, if that rarely happens, then you just take them for granted. So these like pleasures that are really important in life, like being able to walk around easily and that kind of thing, you don't enjoy. And then after they're taken away from you for a while, you do enjoy them again, and people report greater satisfaction or gratification from things like eating and being able to walk after they've been denied those luxuries. Is that the right word for a while? Anyway, there's a cluster of psychological phenomena, hedonic treadmills, adaptive preferences that point to this thing. And you're right, it is sort of a cliche, and yet I have to say it matters a lot to me. So I myself, I don't want to dwell on it because it's not a fun topic, but when I had cancer a little over 2 years ago, and I'm speaking to you now in November 2024, I worried about dying quite a lot. And of course, in the end, it was just a stage 1 cancer, and the 10-year survival rates for my cancer are very high. So I guess I shouldn't worry so much about dying anymore, but it's certainly true to my experience that I'm more grateful just to have more weeks, months, years to live. So I'm enjoying just being alive in a way. So I just want to say it's sort of true that when you have something that really derails you in the sense that certain goods that you take for granted, like, I don't know, being able to live for a while longer, are deprived, it does create a sense of gratitude, which somehow makes you enjoy them all the more. But there is a kind of grim afterthought here for me, which is that although I do feel quite a bit better after my back problems go away, my injuries go away, and my cancer seems to have subsided, I have this thought that, well, as I get older, more and more problems are going to arise that will become chronic ones. And with greater frequency, I will find that I have a new problem that no doctor believes they can treat, and that I have no good reason to believe will go away. And so then there won't be an experience of gratitude when I recover normal functioning. There'll just be this sense of loss, I suppose, or remorse.
Yeah, well, that's very tough. I suppose the good memories will be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in some ways, of course, we're all kind of spiraling down that path, right? I mean, we all know that life is finite and I mean, I guess that's the scary part. We all know that we'll go down that road of kind of gradual kind of yeah,
Decline in
decline and
functioning. Yeah.
yeah, and functioning and more sickness and it just happens to everyone. So I do practice this kind of stoic activity of like a memento mori, which is like reflection on
Hmm.
your own death. And I don't do it like every day, but I do it pretty often, like, usually like once a week or so. And I find it kind of liberating in the sense that I know that is part of my reality. And it actually helps me to appreciate life a little bit more. I mean, I don't mean to say like it's some kind of cure for everything, but the finitude actually does help me to focus in a bit more and recognize the good, and to try to make more of life.
Another advantage that occurs to me is that it just makes you a more sympathetic person, you know? You can better understand or grasp how other people are suffering. Apparently,
Hmm.
there's some research showing that we're better at eliciting sympathy from others by providing a kind of psychosocial narrative that explains your suffering. So if you can talk about how your family mistreated you or people at your school or workplace bully you or what have you, those are very compelling stories and people find them very relatable, such that they empathize, they imagine themselves in your place. It's harder to elicit sympathy for physical suffering. It's like I guess you can just talk a lot about
Hmm.
how painful something is. People
Hmm.
just don't, it's harder for them to simulate or vicariously imagine being in that kind of pain.
Hmm.
But I think one really notable example for me is back pain. This is something that adults I remember in my life being younger and hearing adults complain about it all the time. And I thought, okay, this is a really boring topic. um,
Yeah.
but now, as I get older, I'm 50
Yeah.
and I'm still close with a lot of my friends from high school. And it seems just about everyone has back pain now. And
Hmm.
it's really debilitating and
Hmm.
miserable.
I wouldn't be too hard on yourself
Yeah.
when you're young. I mean, you just don't have the right experiences and the perspective to really grasp those things. But yeah, we do when we get older, that's for sure. And yeah, it does make us empathize more. So maybe that's good, right? Maybe that's part of what it
Yeah.
is to belong to this kind of wider human community in which we can kind of sympathize, at least if we have the right kind of attitude and concern.
It is a big upside. I mean, I think it's that kind of the social solidarity you get and the capacity to empathize is really valuable. Yeah, speaking of empathizing with your parents, caring about your parents' interests and that sort of thing, that seems like it's
Mhm.
right on topic for today.
Yeah, that's right. Well, today's topic is really one of the core ideas of Confucianism, which has to do with partiality and differentiated care. Now, that might sound like abstract concepts, but I think all of us really grasp it quite intimately, which is that we really do have these special relationships and we have special concern for those that we have these deep, long, profound histories with, especially, let's say, our family members, our parents, our children, our siblings, our aunts and uncles, and so on, or even friends as well, right? Now, there's a central concept which anyone who studies Confucianism knows, which is xiao, or filial piety is usually the translation, which is a key virtue for Confucians, right? It helps us to feel, think, and act properly toward our parents. And there's this tremendous weight placed on by Confucians on the duties and responsibilities toward our parents. And also we have just much stronger obligation for family members according to Confucians. Now that gives rise to some possible philosophical challenges. And there are these passages in Confucian text which have been widely discussed and they possibly generate certain morally problematic consequences. And so these passages have been discussed by a lot of scholars. And so we want to really dive into just a few of these passages, really two. And the first one that we'll talk about is from the Analects, 1318. And the other one is from the Mengzi, 7a35. Again, these are really well known passages that anyone really familiar with the Confucian tradition will have thought about. But they are really interesting. And I don't think some of these debates are really settled. So I think they should be interesting to our listeners as well.
Yeah, that's right. So there's this view of Confucianism not just as a philosophical position or kind of a worldview or an ideology, but also as a force, a cultural force, where according to which Confucianism, a core kind of commitment for Confucians is what we'll call just very roughly family first.
Hmm.
Family before public interest, family before the state. That seems to be particularly relevant for these two passages that you mentioned, Analects 13:18 and Mencius 7:35. So the interests of your family members for you as an individual moral agent get some kind of priority. And there's a lot of debate about like what kind of priority it is. And, it's not like the family interests trump everything else. It's not like they override all of their interests. Certainly, good Confucians still care about more distant relations, coworkers, colleagues, even humanity in general, certainly other members of their communities and countries and that kind of thing. So it sets us up for a very interesting debate, which maps pretty well onto debates that people can have in almost any time and place in human history, including the present day, because people still feel these tensions between their special obligations, their special interests and commitments to people that they are particularly attached to, like their family members, and their more
Hmm.
impartial obligations to, obey the law, observe certain principles of fairness or justice in public life and that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
that's what we will be discussing after the intermission music. See you shortly. And we are back after a three-front assault, or maybe, anyway, a three-front advance on Richard's recording studio by the three older kids, Maria, Emmy, and Andrew. Well timed, I must say, because they arrived just after we stopped recording part one, and they were determined to distract you and distract me, and they
Hmm.
utterly succeeded. But fortunately for our listeners, they didn't interfere with the actual recording itself.
Yeah, we got
So,
lucky. Now you said recording studio, just to be sure. Like I'm in the attic of my
yeah,
house
right. All
with
right.
just toys and just
Strewn about
messy.
behind you. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I shouldn't exaggerate. This is a, what do they call it? A shoelace? Shoestring operation. Yeah.
Just an operation. Yeah, it's a good term. Yeah.
Yeah. So our topic, once again, is essentially family interests, cases where family interests compete with state interests, or the demands, sort of ethical, moral demands toward a family compete with ethical demands of state or the public interest. Maybe that's another way of phrasing the dilemmas or framing the dilemmas. So that will be in the subject, the kind of the featured passages for this particular topic are going to be Analects 13:18, which is sort of informally known as the upright Gong passage. So I think that's how I'm going to refer to it. And then also Mengzi or Mencius 7a35. It's essentially a hypothetical story where one of Mencius's disciples asks him, what would this famously filial sage king do if he was emperor, as he was, at the time that his father committed murder? Would he enforce the death penalty essentially against his father or not? So we'll get to that one soon enough. We're going to look first very closely at Analects 13:18, and Richard was going to read that one.
Okay, so this is Analects 1318, Edward Slingerland's translation. The Duke of Shu said to Confucius, among my people, there is one we call upright Gong. When his father stole a sheep, he reported him to the authorities. Confucius replied, among my people, those who we consider upright are different from this. Fathers cover up for their sons, and sons cover up for their fathers. Uprightness is to be found in this.
There it is. This is a very famous passage. Some
Hmm.
people think hugely influential to
Hmm.
this very day, starting at least in the Han Dynasty up to the present day. There's been a sort of principle of law that generally requires that the state allow children and parents, family members to cover up for one another, that they not be punished for covering up for one another. This is sort of a understandable, it's sort of built into the legal codes themselves that this be an understandable move. And some people cite this very passage as the source of sort of the inspiration for these legal codes. But what's nice about it is it puts the point very clearly, which is that it seems like they're competing, the Duke of Shu, this Duke, and Confucius are offering competing interpretations of uprightness. And you can see how the Duke of Shu, being a ruler, is tempted to see uprightness in terms of commitment to the public interest, a commitment to the state's interest, maybe, such that you're supposed to admire someone all the more if they can instantiate or exhibit their commitment to the public interest over and against, even in some really hard cases, such as when their own parents commit crimes. And Confucius just rejects that notion of uprightness completely. He says, where I come from, among my people, fathers cover up for their sons, sons cover up for their fathers. Uprightness
Hmm.
is to be found in this. So this is one of the reasons, among many others, that people now characterize Confucianism as a family first, sometimes consanguineous kind of ethical worldview. But there's actually many different ways of slicing it, of sort of analyzing it, explaining what's going on here. Sometimes you could say, well, perhaps it's generally in the public interest for people to have tightly knit families, especially in the relatively agrarian societies that the early Confucian writers found themselves in. So there's some people who actually do try to reconcile what we might generally describe as public interest or the public good with this idea that you should put your family first. But I think both you and I, Richard, are interested in virtue ethics and relatively committed to this idea that the Confucian philosophers, for them, notions of virtue are doing a lot of the work of explaining their ethical judgments, their ethical views. So I'm tempted to read it in this, I think, relatively more conventional way as holding the following view, that the reason it's upright to cover up for your father, if you happen to know that your father stole a sheep, is because your father's interests, his welfare, his well-being, count more for you than do other people's, just in virtue of the fact that he is your parent, that you have this special relationship to him. And the same goes for other members of your family. And the same goes to a lesser degree. The same goes also for people who are related to you, but in a weaker sense of related, such as neighbors, close friends, maybe more distant family members, like cousins, second cousins, and so on. And then you have even kind of weaker obligations to promote the interests or protect the interests of people that are just members of your community more generally, but not people that you know all that well, and so on and so forth. So there's this implicit image, sometimes almost made explicit, of concentric circles, according to which, in the inner circle is your immediate family. And then the next ring out is maybe close friends or kind of slightly more distant family members. And then community members and so on. There are many different ways of spelling out what goes on in the middle and outer rings of the concentric circle. But on some versions of these concentric circles that are sort of depicted by various Confucian philosophers, at the outermost ring are things like animals, maybe even further out are plants and inanimate things. Wang Ming seems to suggest that we can even have some very weak concern for things like tiles or roof tiles, when they're
Hmm.
broken. Anyway, the point is, I think everyone sort of grasps this intuitively. Ultimately, or in some fundamental sense, the interests of people that you're closely related to, especially your family members, just count for more. They make more demands for you, ethically or morally speaking. They make more demands on you than the interests of other people. Anyway, that's one way of reading this passage,
Hmm.
the upright Gong passage, 1318.
Now, from a virtue ethical perspective, though, I suppose one might wonder, well, but doesn't this go against certain other virtues? Maybe one worries about the virtues of justice or the
Yeah,
virtues of honesty. So, like covering up, what
yeah,
exactly does that involve? Like, does that involve like lying to people and being dishonest to the public? And then I guess like people might weigh honesty in different ways or wonder if there is always a rule against dishonesty. But honesty seems like a, kind of a basic virtue, although I wonder if that would have been considered like a basic virtue within the Confucian tradition. I don't really know if that's well discussed. But
yeah,
yeah, yeah. So you might wonder, what about justice? What you owe to, let's say, the people whose sheep was lost. One
right.
issue here is, of course, the passage is very condensed and quite brief, and you don't quite get all the context. So I suppose we might fill out the case a little bit differently and wonder about how things might go. I mean, maybe Confucius would have said, well, yeah, you also got to replace the sheep. And that might plausible as well. But we don't want the father to spend years in jail for, I guess another question is, yeah, how much punishment would have been involved in stealing a sheep? I have no idea. Like, I guess
Yes,
these are
right.
parts of the context, right? And like, do you get your hand chopped off for stealing? I mean, there are cultures would happen. And then I
Yes,
guess if I
yes,
think about it like that, I would think, well, maybe I'll try to restore like, what was lost to those people because it's not right. But I don't want my father's, hand to be amputated. So it's understandable you'd want to cover up. So I guess those are some of the missing parts of the passage.
Yes, you're right. There are a lot of details missing. And so, not surprisingly, if you look at the traditional commentators, you see a lot of people arguing about those details. One can't help shake the impression that some of the commentators are motivated to fill in details in their own distinctive way because they have different views about how seriously to take this family first ethics. So, there's some people who try to downplay the seriousness of the crime and
Mm-hmm.
suggest that it was kind of a theft of opportunity, that like the sheep just wandered into his property. And so he thought, oh, if I
Mm-hmm.
keep it, no one will notice,
Mm-hmm.
which is supposed to make it somehow more forgivable. And I assume that the commentators who are tempted by that view, maybe this is unfair, but because there's some sort of philological linguistic issues at stake here. But one suspects that there were some people who kind of like this idea that the state has a relatively strong claim on people. And so they don't want to read this passage as suggesting that upright sons should cover up for really heinous crimes or terrible crimes against the state. But you raise a number of really interesting questions, Richard. So there's this issue of to what extent is it, I mean, is it understood as a dilemma? And what exactly does that imply if it is a dilemma? I guess I want to say there's a thin sense in which it's pretty obviously a dilemma. It's not just immediately obvious. There are at least two tempting choices. I think when most people hear the story, they realize that there are at least two tempting choices. And it's not immediately obvious which one you should choose. It's really tempting just in the course of natural moral deliberation to stop at this point where you present yourself with two options. Either you cover up for your father or you don't, and start weighing the pros and cons for each of those two options. So it's a dilemma in that sense. And then there are other kind of more deeper or more, stronger senses of dilemma that sometimes come up in philosophy nowadays in the 20th and 21st centuries, where it's something like if it's a dilemma in the strong sense, then it's a dilemma where either option comes at some cost. Like there's some price to be paid, ethically or morally speaking, for choosing either option. And how you cash out that price varies a lot. So some people say if there's a price, then there should be some kind of ethical residue, which you have to kind of remedy. Like at the very least, you should feel regret, about having to violate the law and cover up for your father. Maybe even furthermore, you should like take some steps. And I think this is what you were suggesting, Richard, take some steps to kind of remedy or rectify the situation. Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe the really astute, upright son would both cover up for his father and then like go see to it that the neighbor who lost the sheep gets the sheep back or something like that. So anyway, there are lots of ways of spelling it out. And there's just, yeah, not quite enough context, I think, in the passage itself to say how it's settled. But there's certainly a lot of context that comes from the later commentarial tradition and later Confucian philosophy to fill
Mm-hmm.
in some of those details.
Mm-hmm. And I should note this. I don't know if you're reminded of the old Plato's Euthyphro dialogue, but it kind of
Yeah,
starts like this. Do you remember that? Because everyone talks about,
yeah,
of course, the Euthyphro problem, about
yeah,
grounding, morality in God's commands or in goodness itself. But the way the dialogue starts is that Socrates comes across this guy who is about to prosecute his own father, and Socrates is kind of shocked. And you get the sense that Socrates was maybe kind of more sympathetic to Confucius, as
yeah.
I remembered the dialogue reading it like 20 years ago. And he's like,
Yes,
"Oh, you're going to prosecute your own father?" And, and he's kind of like
yeah,
raising an eyebrow. And yeah, it's interesting. Just remember this, that
yeah.
part
It's
of the
it's
dialogue.
yeah. It is actually striking. There are a lot of striking similarities. It just goes to show how these sorts of dilemmas, these anecdotes, can really elicit and draw a lot of attention from whole thought traditions. So on the Euthyphro account, so yeah, Socrates comes across this guy, and I think to Greek readers, I don't know, there are people, no doubt we have people in our listening audience who could speak with much more authority about this than I, but I think to Greek readers, the guy that Socrates comes across, Euthyphro, is supposed to come across as a little full of himself, a little self-righteous. He's like
Mm-hmm.
he's clearly supposed to be a very pious person,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that's the subject of their dialogue is essentially
Right.
piety.
Mm-hmm.
And like the mark of his piety is that even though it's his own father, he's going to trial. He's
Mm-hmm.
going to publicly prosecute his father for abusing a slave. So it just seemed obvious to him that his father's abuse of a slave was a really terrible thing, and thus he wanted to try the case in court and see to it that his father was punished. And I think Socrates is, I'm not sure it's actually not clear to me what Socrates' view about the actual case is. I think he's mostly attacking Euthyphro for his kind of smug
Mm-hmm.
self-righteousness, his like certainty, maybe that's better, for his
Hmm.
confidence that
Yeah.
he knows the correct course of action.
Mm-hmm.
And thus they spend a lot of time defining piety and trying to figure out whether he even has a good grip on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's usually Socrates's kind of mode of operation to try to especially question people who seem too confident in their viewpoint. And yeah, this did come off as a kind of Javert-like figure from like Les Miserables, who's just like, well,
Oh yeah.
obviously justice, demands this one thing. And there's a sense in which, yeah, but it is your father. Really, you're not troubled at all. Like
Yeah.
even if
Yeah.
you can kind of see yourself, I mean, it seems like you should at least feel some kind of conflict in yourself.
Yeah. I wanted to elaborate on a couple of things that you said though, Richard. It seems like there are a number of ways of describing if there is a dilemma there, or maybe multiple dilemmas. It could fall under multiple descriptions. And one of them is to see it as a case of having to choose between filial piety, which itself may be like kind of the core constituent of this other virtue known as Ren, benevolence or humaneness. So it could be a matter of choosing between benevolence or humaneness, filial piety, and honesty. And for me, actually, that's a quite appealing way to frame it because I imagine myself having to cover up for family members. And I think one of the hardest things about it would just be that kind of in your face, blatant dishonesty. It would be hard to be that. I imagine, you'd have to swear under oath or, talk to actual law enforcement officials and say with a straight face that you know nothing about this sheep. That to me already seems like it's sort of compromising my integrity. So and I do think, by the way, that this word jur, which is being translated as uprightness, does
Hmm.
imply honesty. There are other passages that sort of
Mm.
suggest there's a passage, I can't remember what it is exactly, but that suggests that jur, probably understood as like strict honesty and,
Hmm.
behaving honorably in all things, needs to
Hmm.
be modified, needs to be moderated by li, by ritual propriety. So it's quite likely, if you think about the context, that what Gongzi has in mind in that other passage is that there are times where like politeness essentially needs to play a kind of softening or moderating role in your honesty. You don't just want to like tell people how they
Hmm.
look or say, you know, your hair grew gray overnight. You must be getting old or something like that.
That's
There
right.
are lots
Yeah,
of,
yeah, yeah. Have you gained a little weight? I mean, no, that's not
yeah,
a.
exactly. Right. So there are lots of cases where you don't necessarily want to say it as you see it. Yeah. So I think that's one way of characterizing the dilemma. But I think the other one that really speaks to people and taps into people's most conflicted intuitions is to depict it as a conflict between devotion to family, filial piety, and justice. Justice understood as sort of a public virtue, a virtue for
Hmm.
behaving well in the public sphere insofar as you're interacting in ways that matter, where sort of goods are at stake that can be distributed fairly or unfairly. So there's a lot of debate actually in the 21st century about whether this passage is responsible for certain cultures of corruption,
Hmm.
nepotism, and so on.
Hmm.
Some people, some scholars in the present day have extrapolated from this passage, or they've generalized from this passage and suggested that because Confucius endorses this particular sort of devotion to family over and above state or public interests, you now see the foundations for or the roots of this general view that you're allowed, if you're a boss of a big company or a state employee, to like hire family members into the coveted positions and position
Hmm.
people and give them the plum assignments that for which they'll get rewarded and that kind of thing. That kind of
Hmm.
corruption. Usually, most people, I think nowadays, no matter what culture you grew up in, even if you grew up in a very Confucian culture, that kind of corruption where public officials are appointing their own kids and nieces and nephews to the plum positions, even though they're not qualified. So they're
Hmm.
like, I don't know, in charge of like distribution of like farming equipment or something, and they're terrible at it, and the people suffer
Hmm.
for it.
Hmm.
The farmers suffer for it. Most people think that's a really awful thing.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
some people think that in a similar way, Analects 1318, the upright Gong story, is pitching our commitments and the listeners or readers' commitments to the interests of family members over and against the interests of justice, yeah, our commitments to
Yeah.
justice.
And we haven't talked about Mois quite enough, I think, but yeah, they
Yeah.
also maybe are responding to this kind of idea here in the Analects by having this idea of like promoting the worthy and having this kind of system in which we promote those who are doing a good job. And it's not based on familial ties, it's not based on those like personal connections, but it's based
Yeah.
on how well you performed a task connected to the role you have. And so maybe the Moists were kind of worried about exactly about this kind of topic and what it leads to.
You're right, Richard. I am so accustomed to teaching intro courses where we've had a whole unit on Moism that I sometimes forget. A lot of people don't know what Moism is. So, yeah, maybe we
Mm,
should say just a little bit about that. So, Moism is a very interesting school of thought from ancient China, which was, for a time, I would say, among the many schools of thought in the so-called Hundred Schools period, in the running for one of those that was most likely to succeed and stand the test of time. I think if we transported ourselves back in time and talked to a lot of well-educated people and asked them which of the schools of thought that are competing right now in this very pluralistic period are still going to be around 400 years hence, I think many of them would have said Moism. Moism seemed to appeal to a lot of highly literate people in that day and age. And for that reason, Confucianism started to conceive of itself as kind of a rival to Moism. When we get to Mencius, who comes along later than Confucius, he's the second great Confucian sage. He basically sees Moism as one of the two chief rivals to Confucianism. The other one is Yangism, so-called ethical egoism or privatism. So yeah, that's saying a little bit about Moism, this rival school of thought. And Richard, I think, has now pointed to the two things that I think are most salient here, which are, first of all, Moism is committed to a kind of strict meritocracy in government, with the one exception being perhaps the actual monarch, the actual head of state, the king or emperor, the son of heaven. But other than that, everyone who's chosen should be chosen on the basis of merit. And it's the monarch's job to make sure that that's happening under his supervision. Like you say, we think now more than ever, actually, we have this view that public positions are for the public interest, and thus the primary consideration, maybe the only consideration, other than maybe something like social stability or some guarantee of continuity and predictability. Are they qualified for the job? Will they execute the job well in an ethical way and competently? And so that's one consideration. Another thing is that Moism is officially committed to this view that they call impartial care, 兼爱. And there's a lot of debate about what exactly it means to be committed to impartial care or impartial caring. But I think on the most plausible reading of this doctrine, impartial caring, and certainly on the view that the Confucians attribute to Mois. So, for purposes of reading texts like the Analects and the Mengzi, this is a useful way of understanding it. Impartial caring is committed to this view that ultimately the interests, what they call the li, which are something like interests, maybe well-being of all people, should count equally for any individual agent, that they shouldn't see the interests of a total stranger as making less of a claim on them than the interests of a parent. Now, that's sort of an ultimate claim. It's like about kind of the basic foundational grounds from which we build in ethics. And it might be that for various reasons, you're going to do more good by focusing on the people that you know and know very well and live with, share a roof with, and that kind of thing, share a home with. But still, there is this idea that at the end of the day, everyone's interests should count equally for you. And sometimes, even if you do think that you should be nicer to your parents than to total strangers, sometimes that view about the ultimate good will, or what's ultimately of value, will have pretty unhappy implications for you because, I don't know, say a family member's life is in danger, and somehow you can show that it's in the greater interest of people in general that you give up that life, you let that life go. Well, that's a really hard thing to do. And Wang Yiming, for example, he gave this example. If you only have so much food, and you have a lot of people starving, he thinks if you're a good Confucian, you make sure your family gets fed first before strangers, even if somehow the strangers might be able to make a better claim. They somehow might do more good by giving the food to the strangers. So,
Mhm.
yeah. And over and against that view of impartial caring, Confucians established a view that has come to be called 爱有差等 in Chinese, which translates as something like care with distinctions, or care has distinctions, most literally. Or care comes with gradations. That's another way of putting it. It comes in degrees. You owe the greatest amount of care or concern to the people in that innermost circle, and it's a little bit less to people in the next circle out, and so on. So, yeah, there's a way of reading this passage as arguing against the Moist view. And the Moists aren't really around yet, so they don't come along until, by the time we get to Mencius, the Moists have really established themselves. But still, it could be that, let me just put it this way. The upright Gong passage was certainly read as offering a counterpoint to the Moist worldview, even if he himself wasn't explicitly responding to Moist. And then the other option, of course, for us in terms of like who he might be responding to is legalist
Hmm.
philosophers who really do very explicitly put the state interests first.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right. So I'm glad that you nicely articulated there this juxtaposition between the most impartial care and the Confucian partial care view. And a lot has been, of course, written on that. And in fact, Mengzi, we'll turn to this passage from Mengzi in just 1 second. But yeah, Mengzi is trying to argue against the Moist view. And in fact, he explicitly says that. And he thinks ultimately it gets morality wrong. But yeah, maybe we should turn to this next passage from the Mengzi, Justin. Maybe
Yeah.
you'd like to read the second passage that we would like to focus on. Also, a very well known passage about this topic.
Yes. So one thing that Richard mentioned in his discussion of the upright Gong passage is that we don't really know how bad this crime was that the son is covering up for. So the upright Gong passage gives some wiggle room to people who want to interpret Confucianism as a more pro-state ideology or philosophy. So they're the people who really want Confucianism to be more pro-state, and they could say, well, he was a minor theft of a sheep, we don't know. Maybe it was a rich family, maybe it was a rich neighboring kind of estate with lots and lots of grazing animals, herding animals. And so they wouldn't have noticed it one way or another. Maybe it was a theft of opportunity where the sheep just sort of wandered into his property and it wasn't like he was plotting and scheming to get the sheep.
Mhm,
And so they're
mhm,
trying to soften it. Well, if you do want to read Confucianism as a more pro-state philosophy, you are going to be a little bit frustrated by the next passage
mhm,
7a35, Mencius 7a35. Because in this one, we're asked, what would an emperor, the Emperor Shun, who I should add was famously filial. I mean, he's sort of famous for being extremely filial. And we'll say a little bit more about that shortly, like how filial he was. He was extraordinary. It's about what he would do if his father committed murder while he was emperor. Would he carry out the necessary punishments in the state interest or in the public interest, as one might expect? And also preface this by saying, I think this is a relevant bit of kind of story plot that according to the legends that Mencius and his interlocutors are assuming, presupposing, Shun's parents were pretty awful people. He also has this brother that was pretty awful. Xiang is his name. So his father, apparently he had the kind of moniker, the blind man. So I'm going to make reference to him. In the translation we're reading, he's referred to as the blind man. So that's the father. And his father was cruel to him. He tried to kill him. He tried to interfere with Shun's success. Shun eventually got chosen to be the next emperor. So he didn't come into it by inheritance. He was chosen simply because he was so virtuous by the Emperor Yao to be the next emperor. And that was an object of great resentment and jealousy on the part of his family. So they're pretty awful people. And yet Shun continues to be deeply devoted to them, as we'll see. So here it is, Mencius 1735. Mencius's disciple Tao Ying asked, when Shun was son of heaven, which is to say emperor, and Gao Yao was his minister of crime, if the blind man had murdered someone, what would he have done? What would they have done? So what would Shun and his minister of crime have done? Mencius said, Gao Yao, that's the minister of crime, would simply have arrested him. Tao Ying, Mencius' student, asked, so Shun would not have forbidden it? Mencius said, how could Shun have forbidden it? Gao Yao had a sanction for his actions. Tao Ying asked, so what would Shun have done? And here's the key part. Mencius said, Shun looked at casting aside the whole world like casting aside a worn sandal. He would have secretly carried him on his back and fled to live in the coastland, happy to the end of his days, joyfully forgetting the world. So, faced with a similar sort of, the Van Norden translation, by the way. So, faced with a similar sort of dilemma that seems to pitch public interest, the interests of the state, against devotion to family, Shun makes what I take to be a pretty great sacrifice. He gives up the highest position available, the most prestigious, kind of coolest position available to him, and all the glory of being the son of heaven, being the emperor, for the sake of saving his father, who's kind of a scoundrel, who really is a scoundrel, and has been pretty awful to him. And he would flee with him on his back. So he'd carry them off. I guess we're supposed to assume he needs to be carried. He's maybe a little feeble and carry him off to live essentially in the hinterlands, in a kind of wild area, which itself is not very fun. And it adds, he would be happy to the end of his days, joyfully forgetting the world. So it seems like he'd have no regrets about giving up everything that he did. That's how devoted he is. That's how much he loves his father, despite everything. So I want to point out that now this really is making a striking trade-off, really, between Shun's commitment to his own family, to his father, and to his interest more broadly. But moreover, there's a sacrifice of public interest too here. This is not just a great sacrifice for Shun, it's a great sacrifice for all the people of ancient China. Because Shun was a great emperor. He brought peace. It was sort of a golden age. All the sick and elderly, even the orphans and such, were cared for, according to some accounts. So they do expect that moral agents put the interests of their own family members before the interests of the state or the world.
Yeah. I was also struck by sort of carrying his father, right? That's like Xiao, right? The character for filial piety in classical Chinese. It's supposed
Hmm.
to be kind of a pictograph. I mean, I don't know if it's a
Yes.
pictograph or what form it is. I'm sorry, but it's supposed
Yep.
to represent like a child, right, carrying the parent on the back. So I was like,
Yes.
wow, it tried to really even capture. Oh, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but even
Yeah,
try to
no, that's
capture
right.
that character. Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. It's supposed to be evocative of the very character Xiao. So back before paved sidewalks and easy modes of transportation and such, that's something that filial children had to do for their elderly parents. They had to carry them sometimes.
And now some people have wondered also if this passage also involves a moral dilemma. And I guess I
Yeah.
was always inclined to think it does not, partly because Mengzi does not identify anything that Shun regrets. So Shun doesn't, he's just happy, right?
Yeah.
He's happy to the end of his days, joyfully forgetting the world. Whereas if you're in a moral dilemma and you make a choice, that means you're not able to, I mean, there's different kinds of moral dilemmas, but in a standard case, you're not able to meet some obligation. And so you feel some moral regret because you weren't able to fulfill all of your obligations. But in this case, it just seems like Shun just thought, I did the right thing and I'm happy to live
Yeah.
with my father. And who cares about the empire? And
Yeah. No
although
regrets.
no regrets. And so it's interesting because you might have wondered, well, Shun, but what about the people? Like, don't you feel bad for them?
Yeah.
And you do wonder what his response would have been. Maybe it would have been like, well, yeah, I hope that they do well. Maybe, hopefully, they'll get a better emperor than than I was, or maybe he's just so humble. He just thought, I'm just a normal, just okay, even though he turned out to be one of the best. But he's so humble. Maybe that's how he thought, or he just thought, well, look, my father was in trouble, and I love my father, and that's all there is to it. And what is there to think more about? This is how you should act too, by the way. And so
Yes.
I feel no regret. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So just to, I guess, to underscore something Richard said. So earlier we talked about how there's stronger and weaker senses of this word dilemma. In the weak sense, it just means it's kind of a hard decision where you have to choose between two options. And then there's a stronger sense, according to which when any option you choose will come at some cost. And then you can cash that idea of cost out in different ways. One of them that's most popular among scholars who work on ethics these days is, especially moral psychology and virtue ethics, is to talk about regret, agent regret. And so it's basically, on this view, you have a dilemma in the stronger sense. When there's no option to choose, there's no way to resolve it without it being the case that you should feel some regret. It's appropriate to feel some regret, to regret that you couldn't have done otherwise, and at the very least. And then maybe that other things follow, like you owe people apologies or some kind of recompense, you should make it up to them somehow. And what's striking about, and so what Richard's point here, I really like this, Richard, is that, yeah, if you're looking for signs of regret, they're hard to find because Shun, it says explicitly, he lives in the coastland, having given up his position with his father, happy to the end of his days, joyfully forgetting the world. Forgetting the world doesn't sound like you regret depriving the people of the central states of your services. So, yeah, that's right. We can take a cue, I think, from Stephen Engel, my co-author of the book Neo-Confucianism. I've mentioned him before. He has in his book Sagehood a kind of analysis of Confucian approaches to dilemmas, where he says, actually, on the Confucian view, the goal is what he calls harmony. And essentially, what you have in any situation that looks like a dilemma to the rest of us, looks like there are some hard choices to be made where invariably whatever you choose will come at some cost. He says, actually, what's going on there is you have an invitation to someone who has really astute, acute, kind of creative or imaginative capacities to arrive at new solutions to moral problems, moral quandaries. And that's sort of the sage figure who has these almost perceptual capacities to kind of see the best way forward in these tough situations. And so I think 7A35, this story about Shun and his father committing murder, it's a good case study, a good bit of textual evidence for Steve for his argument. Because Steve wants to say, yeah, actually what we see is that sages can come up with a solution where, in fact, there isn't a price to be paid. One of the analogies Steve uses that people often do when they talk about this word harmony in the Confucian context has to do with making meals like a soup. And he suggests you can take the various values that are at stake, whatever they are, justice, fairness, kind of the welfare of the state, of the people, filial piety, and so on. You can take all those competing interests and you can think of them as like ingredients that go into a soup. And the sage is the person who's like a master chef, able to mix them in just the right way so they make an even better soup.
Mm-hmm.
And one key point that Steve makes in his book Sagehood, and then also a related paper, which I'll be sure I need to remind myself to put them into the show notes. One point he makes is that the Confucian harmony view, as he understands it, basically wants to honor all of those ingredients. It wants to honor all those competing values. So you look at this case, it's not just that Shun, this is actually something that's sort of subtle that people are quick to overlook. Shun doesn't necessarily plunk down on the side of filial piety here. There's still subtle ways in which he honors the value of being a fair law enforcer or sort of overseeing fair law enforcement as the emperor. Why? Well, because he resigns his position, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before he flees with his father. So it's not like he's just abusing his power in some kind of really blatant way
Mm-hmm.
and ordering people to release his father and allowing his father to live happily ever after in the Central States where there's more civilization and more accoutrements of civilization, more kind of creature comforts and such. No. First he resigns. So he's no longer breaking the law as an emperor, right? And there's a kind of concession there to the importance of impartial justice and your role as a political leader, as a head of state, as a ruler, that suggests that in fact he's still honoring these other competing
Mm-hmm.
values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Because he doesn't obstruct the role of the minister, right, of crime. So
Yes.
he doesn't
Yeah.
impede the fulfillment of that guy's role, which maybe would be unjust. So then he finds a way of not abusing his power as the king because he abdicates from the throne. And then just as a
Yeah.
commoner, he decides to run off with his father to protect him. It does also strike me as something that's, at least this passage is, as it's told, it is a kind of anti-consequentialist viewpoint here. Maybe that's a
Yeah.
little too modern way of framing it, but it seems to go against this idea that you need to always maximize the good or something. Like you need to do what is greatest for everyone because that, I mean, his
Yeah.
father, I mean, it's just one person, but it seems pretty clear that as the emperor, as a great and virtuous emperor, he would have benefited even more people. And in fact, he clearly was. Yeah, it's not this clear consequentialist mindset. It's about also being filial and these various deep moral responsibilities that
Yeah.
you have.
Over and above the overall greater good for people in general. So
Right, right.
yeah, I think this is a really tough case for people who want to read Confucianism as a kind of consequentialism. This is something that's very interesting to Richard and me because we are philosophers who work on moral philosophy ethics in the 21st century, and it's a hot topic, consequentialism versus its rival theories like virtue ethics. First of all, let me just say very quickly, what is consequentialism? Well, lots of ways of spelling it out, spelling out its core commitments. But one way that really works, I think, to capture the rivals that are in the running, philosophically speaking, in Mencius's time is as follows. Consequentialism is the view that the right action is whatever action maximizes some good across the entire population. And so what is that good? Well, there are different kinds of consequentialists, so they spell out that good differently. They understand it differently. But The best known kind of consequentialist is essentially the utilitarian. So for them, the good is well-being or welfare. And sometimes they understand it just as human welfare. So that's the population in question. Sometimes they understand it even more broadly as animal or the welfare of sentient beings, maybe. So there is state consequentialism, welfare of the people of the state. But in any case, I think it's hard to read the Mohists any otherwise than as consequentialists. They say that there's this good, which they call Li, fourth tone Li, and not Li as in ritual, but fourth tone Li, which often translates as benefit or profit. Sometimes I think it works pretty well. Well-being works pretty well as a translation of Li. And they say there are three kinds, what we might call the early Mohists say there are three kinds of benefit. The later Mohists define benefit as what it pleases one to get. So in any case, the benefit should be maximized across a certain population. It's not exactly what the scope of that population is. And the right action is whatever it is that maximizes it. And so if you're a consequentialist, and a lot of people find consequentialism a very elegant, appealing moral theory, then I think you have to reject this passage, because I really read this passage as suggesting that Shun was morally obligated to do, that is, he treated as his right action in this situation, or he would have treated this as his right action situation, something that was actually not good for the population overall, which was to abdicate, leaving his empire without a sage ruler.
And
Perhaps
it
some
seems like
people,
you would have said that's not the main goal. The
yeah,
central goal of being a good Confucian or being a good person is not just to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
yeah, exactly. Well, there's actually a lot to say about filial piety in the Confucian tradition and about this view that the family interests come first, graded care, that kind of thing. I have no doubt that we are going to revisit the issue again and again, because not least because there are other passages. So there are other passages that really exhibit the Confucian commitment to filial piety and family interests, but they also test our views about dilemmas and harmony and so on. The idea of harmonizing competing values. I'll just say for now, we can't do it justice in this one episode. So I'll just kind of mention some of the lingering problems that hopefully we'll have a chance to address in the future. One that's probably occurred to some people here, especially people who find consequentialism intuitive or appealing, or somehow like they might even think it's the obvious normative ethical theory to endorse. You might just wonder, what is the justification for prioritizing filial piety so much? And that's a tough issue. And it's kind of too big of an issue to handle here, but I'll just say quickly that there are different views. One is that filial piety is just like the most important constituent or ingredient in this really important virtue known as ren, humaneness or benevolence, goodness, sometimes it's translated as. And then another view is, which is may or may not be related to the first one, is that filial piety is extremely important as a developmental foundation, a root, so to speak, of the plant that becomes a virtue, a mature and full, well-rounded virtue. So there's a very famous passage, Analects 1:2. It's one of the rarer passages of the Analects where it's not Gong who's speaking, but another Confucian master, Yozi. And Yozi says that filial piety, along with this other thing that he calls Ti, brotherly respect, are the roots of humaneness, or at least that's one way of reading the passage. They are the foundation on which humaneness or goodness, these greater virtues, are built. And then there are, of course, arguments, especially in connection with the Mencius, that appeal to human nature, that say it's important to be filial, it's critical to be filial, because it's just in our nature to do so. You're denying your nature in some way. You're denying your human nature, some people would add, and thus, in a sense, denying your humanity by denying your special love and care for and commitment to your own family members. Those are all options in the mix that arguably do or don't overlap, and I'm sure that we will have many opportunities to discuss them in the future. Any other closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions that we'll have to address at some point in the future, although we've made so many promissory notes throughout many
Yeah,
episodes. I
it's true.
wonder if we'll get to them, but I hope we will. Yeah, I also think filial piety is one of these ideas or values or virtues that is definitely not really covered extensively within the Western, especially
Ah,
also like virtue ethical
yeah.
tradition. And Kwang Shun makes this really interesting point that often when people do something like comparative or cross-cultural philosophy, we tend to want to like read, Western thinkers and identify first ideas from the Western tradition, and then note how those ideas we can find also in some form in the, Eastern traditions. But in this case, it's one of these ideas, filial piety, that
Yeah.
seems to be missing in the Western tradition, that it would be interesting to see if, oh, is there some gap there? Is there something, maybe not exactly in the way that Confucians thought about it, but the value of like how we treat our parents and the significance of that and the significance of family in a good human life, are those things that are underaddressed? And I tend to think actually yes. And so that would be like one of these interesting kind of contributions that I think Confucianism or certainly other East Asian traditions possibly might be able to make
Yeah.
for the Western philosophical discourse. So I think that's kind of noteworthy in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, actually, some of the most interesting work to be done on Chinese philosophy, East Asian philosophy, kind of non-Western traditions in general, is to figure out the questions that they were concerned with and how they frame those questions, and figure out how that enriches Western dialogue rather than just looking for ways of sort of plumbing the text, picking and choosing, cherry
Hmm.
picking from the text to look for answers to questions that already motivate a lot of Western philosophers.
Hmm.
And this is, yeah, definitely a good example. So why could clearly filial piety is both a central notion and just very important part of the good life for
Hmm.
Confucians. And there's a lot to be said for the Confucians about why that is.
Hmm.
So speaking of family, in addition to the fact that Richard's three children came in to try to distract him during the break, we've continued to have lots of family interaction and magically, almost supernaturally, I must say, from my point of view, managed to keep it out of the recording, Richard. Melanie, my spouse, was talking to me, and I think I saw more of your kids visiting. So I'll just sum it up by saying family calls, and Richard and I are answering that call. That was the way for today. Well, thank you for listening to this episode and look forward to seeing you next time.
Bye, everyone.